Tonight we are going to have an interesting discussion. We have a topic to talk about that maybe all of you have heard of, or maybe none of you have heard of, the responsibility to protect. As nation states have grown out of the time when we were tribal, we have begun to think about ourselves as protectors of other nations, or maybe not protectors of other nations, but invaders and occupiers of other nations. And so part of what we'll talk about, I think, is whether the responsibility to protect also means that we have a responsibility to take over and rule, as we have seen our country do perhaps too often. Our two discussants, Rev Mo, who all of you probably know and love, has traveled in the circles of international concern a lot, and we were honored to meet Mr. Hans von Sponeck when he was the UN coordinator, the humanitarian coordinator in Iraq. We met him at a time that we perceived he was becoming somewhat disgruntled by the role that the United States was playing, right? And so we thought he was a hero when he decided to leave that position, and we became more and more convinced that he was a hero. Hans has been here before in this church and educated us and helped us to understand what was going on, and now he's working on this particular part of our human endeavor. So please join me in welcoming Rev Mo and Hans von Sponeck, and I hope that you will enjoy this. They will have a question and answer back and forth, and then we'll invite you to participate in asking questions as well. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
It's so good to see you. I've been looking forward to this since Bert emailed me and asked if I would be able to be here tonight to be a part of the conversation with you about the responsibility to protect. And I'm going to confess right now, since I'm a pastor, you know, confession is good for us. And I'm going to confess that I was not at all acquainted with that concept, the responsibility to protect, at least not as it's been formulated and written. And so I've been doing quite a bit of reading here and there, now and then, to try and get up to speed with it. And part of what I've been reading has brought back all kinds of memories of the trips to Iraq and then later to Syria that we've made, and given me lots to think about. One of the things I read was the 2012 report by the General Secretary on the progress of the responsibility to protect. And in that, his evaluation was that it is an effective tool for being able to ward off violence in countries and to ensure the human well-being in countries where there is conflict and discord. And in reading the paper that you wrote, I think that was recently, that Bert sent me, read that you don't share that same opinion that the General Secretary does about the use of the responsibility to protect statement and concept. So I wanted to ask you about that. He concluded that it has been used effectively to provide for the well-being of people and allow other means than conflict and war to be used to deal with internal disagreements and even external international disagreements. Can you tell me what your opinion of the effectiveness of that document and that concept has been?
Well, first of all, let me also say thank you that I can be here. I'm grateful to Jerry, of course, and to Bert, and to Bob, and to you, Reverend Mo. This is almost familiar territory here now. And what I think we owe you is not nice rhetoric, but an honest assessment of a concept which is formally, in a formal sense, fairly new. If I can just go a step back, if I may. Yes, you can ask, you can say this booklet that was adopted in your country, in San Francisco in 1945, the UN Charter, is a booklet about our collective responsibility to protect in a wider sense. Every page talks about peaceful resolution of conflicts, about dialogue, about tolerance, all the good things that we want to hear as we sit in a house of God here. So I think that needs to be said. What I also want to stress is when I earlier said it is not a very old concept in a formal sense, then I think as far as the United Nations, where I did my work for 32 long years, I know a little bit about the UN Charter, about the UN objectives. But I can say that maybe until 2005, the concept of responsibility to protect in a formal political sense wasn't there. It was a Canadian initiative. In 2001, the government of Canada, in a moment of despair, I guess, when they looked back and they saw what the earlier decades had brought in terms of genocide, in terms of war crimes, in terms of mass murder, they came to the conclusion the time had come to really rethink a concept which in the 1960s and the 1970s had become so prominent, and that concept was the concept of sovereignty. May I bring that up closer? Yes. Like that, is that okay? Yeah, I hope you can hear me better now. The concept of sovereignty became an immensely important concept in the 1960s. Why 1960s? Because that was really the decade when countries became independent. More and more countries became independent. And as they became independent, the most precious objective was to finally have sovereignty, to finally being masters of their own destiny. So it became really a sacrosanct term. Nobody who tried to influence international relations questioned that concept. Everyone said, we accept sovereignty. When I served in Iraq, there was no UN resolution which didn't stress territorial integrity and sovereignty. But then, as the years went by and these countries had enjoyed decades of independence, things happened, and new concepts came into the debate. For example, the concept of failing states, states where governments were no longer able to guarantee human rights, to guarantee a functioning government apparatus. It wasn't there. So one began in the 1970s to think about how one should exercise international responsibility for countries in failing state, people in failing states. The prime example was Somalia during those years already. And then something else happened. And now, I mean, if I compress this into a few sentences, but it spans several decades. In 1974, you had genocide in Cambodia. In 1994, 20 years later, you had genocide in Rwanda in Africa. And in 1999, you had Srebrenica, the murdering of Muslims in the former Yugoslavia. And all that accumulated to the point where, well, it was the Canadian government that formally introduced this commission to look at how the international community could more responsibly exercise the right to prevent, or when it happened, to reduce these conditions of genocide and mass murder in different countries. So they got this commission together, and then something very dramatic happened, which then in 2005 the UN General Assembly continued to debate and adopt, and that is, one suddenly argued, yes, sovereignty is important, but with sovereignty comes also responsibility. And responsibility has an external and an internal dimension. The external dimension is that you respect the sovereignty of other countries. The internal element had to do with guaranteeing human rights for all segments of the population. No exception. If you lived in country X, human rights should be available to all. And when that was not the case, then the question that was debated and answered was, do we have the right to then, as external parties, to intervene internally? And the answer that was given, yes, we have that right. In a short sentence, human rights became more important than sovereignty. That was, I think, a major new element in international relations. And my long-winded road to Reverend Mo's question is that this right, this human right that supersedes sovereignty, that this was a valuable concept, but under one condition, and that is easier said than done, that there would not be any hidden agenda. And if you start applying, and we must go into that in more detail, when you start applying this concept R2P, responsibility to protect, with a hidden agenda, where you pretend up front, example Libya, that you want to protect civilian populations, and behind the curtain, you are having something quite differently in mind, then this concept, a good concept then, becomes a dangerous concept. And I think that is the difficulty I have, that one must not also assume that the existence of that concept leads to an application that is innocent. It isn't innocent, and it hasn't been innocent, and we should really, because many people in the press also, many analysts now say, why is this concept not being implemented in Syria? Well, the answer is, look at Libya and how it was applied. Maybe I should stop here for a moment.
Well, you could go on forever, as far as I'm concerned.
I would like to adjust this microphone.
But you're at the point now where I have another question that I'd like to address to relate to that. When Jerry and Bert and Dick and others here and Bob were in Iraq in 2002, and we met with Tun Miat to talk to him about the effect of the sanctions on the Iraqi people, We were in the, 11th year of the sanctions at that time against Iraq. And one of the statements he made that I puzzled over in our meeting and kept asking him to explain more deeply was the idea that I was hearing from him that it was the U.S.'s power in applying Resolution 661 for as the decision maker about the sanctions and the materials that would be allowed in and not allowed in. And when I pressed him, he finally said, the U.S. is Committee 661. Committee 661, yeah, which was the committee that made all the decisions about what would be sanctioned and what would not be sanctioned in terms of materials entering Iraq during that time, during those 11 years. And that was also just about the time when the so-called smart sanctions were being initiated. So as I was reading the General Secretary's report from early this year about the progress and the state of affairs with the responsibility to protect, he in one place listed several instances, which you did as well a few minutes ago, of past atrocities and genocides, that this, what can I call it, Hans? Resolution? Decision was designed to prevent, and starting with the Holocaust and including some of those you named. And I thought it was particularly unusual that in 2005 and now in 2012, Iraq was not in that list. Because I remember when we went in 2002, we had just been getting the news about the numbers of children who had died between 91 and 98, excess deaths because of the sanctions, because of the effect of the sanctions. And there was some argument about what that number was. I remember initially it was posited to be about 500,000, and then within the next few years of additional research, I think, the number was close to 700,000 during those years. And then, of course, we all remember, I think, when the question was posed to Madeleine Albright about whether she thought it was worth it. And she said, yes, it is worth it. Now, I don't know what you would call that mass effect of the sanctions over those 11 years. But why do you think that Iraq is not included in any of the discourse in the General Secretary's reports about the kinds of things that this resolution agreement is designed to prevent? And why has nothing emerged, at least if something has emerged, I'm not aware of it, that would call the U.S. to account? And, you know, in reading about your article, I believe, you shared that there is responsibility, but there's also accountability. So how does that fit in?
So it's a very important question. I keep saying if 200 years after the Armenian genocide in Turkey, we start looking for accountability, then that is 180 years too late. And right now, as far as Iraq is concerned, I'm not saying that because I'm in the US that I say it's not just the Americans. I mean, there were others in the Security Council. In fact, one can argue, yes, the engines of sanction policy were in London and in Washington. But after all, let's not forget, there were 15 member countries in the Security Council. They all are accountable. And right now, there are, and I belong to those who insist that accountability cannot be just for the weak and the losers. Accountability has to include everyone. We keep saying in our respective democracies, before the law, everybody is equal. Well, it doesn't seem that before international law, everybody is equal. Maybe there is a deliberate effort now to prevent this debate to go forward and hold people accountable. But how can we allow impunity to prevail when a country has not only had to face a dictator who has been held accountable, he was hung, he's dead, but also international policy. The 500,000 children that died extra death as a result of sanctions is only one example. And I would say it's an academic discussion to say were they 500, were they 600, were they 700,000. I subscribe to the view one child, one human being is so valuable that one extra death as a result of a faulty policy is one death too many. I think that must be so crystal clear. So I think it's for well-endowed universities to do research on, is it 500,000, is it 600,000, is it 520? On the political level, we have plenty of evidence that people died who shouldn't have died as a result, not of the dictator, but of UN Security Council policy. So that's important, I think. That's one thing. The US, yes, it is correct. The US was a lead party in that sanction committee, the 661 committee. It's called 661 because it's resolution 661 of the 6th of August, 1990, where they were the engine together with the British. That is correct. But the others condoned. The others did not get out of their seat and walk out and say, we don't continue to do that. It was the term that I learned to dislike fiercely when I lived in Baghdad was the term collateral damage. Yeah. This is collateral damage. We have to pay this price in the interest of a much broader picture about human rights and democracy and our values. No, it cannot be. But that's how it was argued, and the British and the Americans got away with that. So they are maybe more accountable, those governments, than the other 13 in the Security Council. But the other 13 are also accountable. I very much believe in that. And the concept of smart sanctions, let me just refer to that also. Smart sanctions, that concept arose only towards the end of the 13 years of sanctions against Iraq, when Secretary General Kofi Annan said these comprehensive, all-embracing sanctions against an innocent people are a blunt instrument, his words, a blunt instrument that shouldn't be used anymore. So people started talking about smart sanctions. I just completed a visit to Columbia University, to Yale, to Harvard, to Brandeis, to the University of Chicago, where together with Professor Joy Gordon from Fairfield University, the two of us tried to look a little bit at sanctions on Iraq and a little bit on sanctions on Iran. And what do we discover? In the case of Iran, they talk internationally, the politicians talk about smart sanctions. Smart sanctions are those sanctions which focus on the guilty and not on the innocent. But in the case of Iran, this concept is a misnomer, because the sanctions in their implications for the Iranian people are almost as comprehensive as they were against the Iraqi people. So it's very clever. You can say this is targeted, and therefore the UN Security Council really has nothing to do with that, to protect the people, because it's targeted. If you target the economic sector, the financial sector, you by extension you think you can say you are not targeting, as in the case of Iraq, the people. But in the case of Iran, the brutal truth is that the Iranians are very, very much affected by these so-called smart sanctions in the financial and the economic sectors. So it's a skillful way of maintaining comprehensiveness, and yet call it smart sanctions. It's a misuse of a term, in my view, and the effects, the impact on the people in Iran are increasingly visible. People are getting destitute, the infrastructure is in such a way that people cannot travel easily anymore, the education infrastructure is affected. So what one sees on the horizon is a similar picture of destitution as we have seen in Iraq. Maybe I should not.
Well, you anticipated my next question, so thank you. I wanted to hear your reflections about the sanctions that are being imposed currently on Iran. I raised the question earlier about accountability of those countries that were participating in the sanctions on Iraq, because my fear and my perception today is that there is so much continued lying or deception going on in terms of what is happening in Syria, as there was about Libya, and that the end game has little to do with the so-called support of the rebel forces against the governments, but rather our own interests in both of those countries as part of our interest in the Middle East. And so how do you see the responsibility to protect that applied internationally see, Hans, I must be older than you because I get to these moments when I suddenly lose my train of thought, but I'm going to get it. Is a shield for other kinds of activities of the U.S. and other countries, just like it was in Iraq. And one of those things is the carrying out of a proxy war against Syria, as I understand it.
Well, if I may step back, but coming back to Syria, I would like to remind ourselves of what happened in the first application of this concept, responsibility to protect. It was Libya, no other precedent. When after this 2005 summit, one began to accept the R2P as a formal tool, formal responsibility in the international toolkit. What you say strikes a strong chord with me. You talk about lying, dis and misinformation in the case of Syria. Let's look at what happened in Libya. It's immense when you start looking at the resolution, this resolution 1973 that was adopted in 2011, in the spring of 2011. What do we read there? Let me look here at my notes. It says, and this is the difference to Iraq, where we had no-fly zones also. These no-fly zones in Iraq were illegal. The no-fly zone in Libya was legal. Whether we like it or not, the Security Council adopted it, and that made it internationally, legally correct, okay? In that resolution, we read about a flight ban, no planes in Libyan airspace. The second thing is, you call it no boots on the ground, no foreign military on Libyan soil. Third is an arms embargo. The fourth is freezing the assets of the government. And the justification for that was, we must protect the Libyan civilian population. All right, so far, so good. But then, when it was all over in October of 2011, how did the picture look? First of all, it didn't take long before the French, the British, and in the background a bit, the Americans, openly discussed regime change. So, was it about protecting the people, or was it about regime change? Secondly, there were armed militias. The outside armed them. There were no boots on the ground. Well, there were foreign special forces on the ground.
In civilian
Maybe
clothes.
not, I just want to say, maybe not in visible, identifiable uniforms, but in some civilian clothes. I don't think the Libyan airspace has ever had more traffic than during the years when there was supposed to be a no-fly zone. Planes were flying all the time, but only of a kind. These were NATO planes. And by the way, just to show you how complicated and fragmented this so-called NATO alliance is, only five of the 28 NATO member countries actually participated with military equipment in that Libyan adventure. My own country, well, we were criticized from all sides. Some said you should have vetoed it, others said you should have supported it. We abstained. That was probably a weak response. But anyway, NATO planes were flying all over the place. Yes, government accounts were frozen, but money was flowing freely to the opposition. And the Secretary General, and now we are coming to what you call lying in good American plain language, you say lying. I said once dis and misinformation, and an American friend interrupted me and said, just call it lying. Okay, so the Secretary General of NATO, the former Danish Prime Minister Rasmussen, he had the audacity to go before the world and declare that the Libyan mission of NATO on behalf of the United Nations Security Council had been successful. Yeah. So what is this that is lying? It's dishonest. It simply isn't correct. I heard him say this at the 48th Munich Security Conference last February this year, and he also repeated it in the annual report on NATO, and it was simply a wrong and incorrect and terribly unethical response to the reality and to the fact that these three governments that were the initiators, the French, the British, and the Americans, had openly declared after a while, this is about regime change. It's not about protecting the civilian population, and certainly not protecting those, in quote, innocent people that were on the Gaddafi side. So, you know, and then are you surprised when you now look at the news and you see the Security Council and you see the Russians and Chinese abstaining, vetoing, bombarding any of these attempts to, well, Mrs. Clinton wants to have this Friends of Syria a group of lobbyists to swing the balance so that there are more arms and there's more support flowing to the opposition, and they are against that. And I think this is not an ideological statement; it's a factual statement, in my opinion. The the United Nations cannot possibly support regime change. Where would we end up if suddenly in the Security Council you say, well, sorry, the government of Germany under Mrs. Merkel is no good, it should go. Or some other country in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, the same. It's not possible. That's not what the UN is about. The UN wasn't created to be about that. The UN was created to have a forum where people can come together and discuss a conflict and solve it, hopefully, peacefully. And there is no such concept as an aggressive UN-initiated military confrontation. The UN is very clear on that. The UN Charter has an Article 51 in which it says you can respond with military force for the sake of self-defense. That's all. So what the chief prosecutor in Nuremberg in the trial against Nazi criminals pronounced, an American judge, Robert Jackson, who said the worst crime you can commit is the crime of aggression. Well, what did we do on the 19th of March in moving into Iraq? That was aggression. That was not self-defense. Self-defense, 1991, Operation Desert Storm, US-led coalition was completely legal. You cannot have a country marching into the neighboring country, it was said. Iraq marching into Kuwait. So that was legal. Why was it then not illegal when you moved in on the 19th of March with a coalition force into Iraq? To get rid of the dictator? Maybe that was the real answer. But allegedly, because you wanted to bring responsibility to protect to the Iraqi people. Anyway, I'm just trying to show you how this concept, for the first time, and the only time so far, R2P was applied in the case of Libya, and why, in the case of Syria, there is absolutely no chance for a consensus to do the same in Syria. Because it was a hidden agenda again. I talked earlier about that hidden agenda. You pretend it's about, when I say you, I don't mean US, I mean those in the Security Council who support that, including the US. You pretend it's to protect. Protect who? Whom? The Syrian people or your own interests?
Right.
So
That's where it gets fuzzy, when you consider our own interests.
It gets fuzzy in the sense that the world sits still. The world doesn't react. This General Assembly should react. There is a way, there is one way, only one, but there is one way in which the UN General Assembly can say, what you 15 in the UN Security Council, what you are doing there, we don't accept. And that is called a uniting for peace resolution. That is Resolution 377, if you like to read more about it, Resolution 377 of 1950, where it was said if 2/3 of the member countries of the United Nations object to a decision by the UN Security Council, then the Security Council is overruled. And that should be now the order of the day to do that. But where do you see it? Why is it? Why one can speculate. But in the case of Iraq, when it was a question of deciding over whether or not there should be a war against an invasion, it was Secretary of State Colin Powell who traveled and wrote and said, if you support this resolution, this Uniting for Peace resolution, we in the US government consider that as his words, as an unfriendly act, and it will have implications. So that's bribery. Because for many of the poor countries, that meant cutting off your aid program. And a footnote here, and then I stop just to make that point. When on the 6th of August 1990, the Security Council voted on sanctions on Iraq, there was one country that didn't vote for that, and that was Yemen. And at the end of this voting, the American ambassador went over to his colleague from Yemen and said, "Ambassador, this was the most expensive vote your country has ever carried out." And the following week, the aid program to a very poor, one of the poorest countries on earth, Yemen, was stopped by the US. That's bribery. And when we have that, blackmail, bribery, whatever you want to call it, and I don't think I need to stress what these kind of acts do to international relations, what they do to trust among each other, and over time this has reached now a boiling point. And today the UN Security Council is so immensely divided that there's no chance at all that they will do anything to apply this concept of R2P in the case of Syria. There's a lot more to say, but let me just not do the monologue here.
Well, I have one last question, since we've exceeded our half-hour time. I go to Israel and the West Bank almost every year, sometimes twice a year. And I know that Jerry and Bob go frequently, especially into Gaza. And maybe many of the others of you do too. My question is, what are your reflections about the responsibility to protect in relation to the Palestinian people?
There is an obvious answer, which is blue-eyed and naive. And that, of course, is that the United Nations has a responsibility to continue year after year to apply this concept to the Palestinians. There's no question that the UN Security Council and the General Assembly have a responsibility to protect by admitting. The whole question of the status of Palestine is an example of the weakness of the current international structure. There shouldn't have been any. Let me hold here and just remind us to make the point better. Last July, Southern Sudan became the 193rd member country of the United Nations. That took no time. It was in a week that this all was settled and arranged. How many more decades must the Palestinians wait? They have been waiting since 1948, 67, you can pick a date, but for many, many years have they waited to get that which others get sort of by the shortest possible route, and that is membership, first of all statehood, and secondly membership. And it is shameful that almost a year after Abu Mazen, the Prime Minister of Palestine, had applied to the UN Security Council for membership, and the Council decided on procedural grounds to sit on the paper, not act on it, and nothing has changed. So responsibility to protect is very selective in the attempt to apply, and it has a very short history, and it will continue to have that short history as long as we have this double standard, you know.
Thank you for answering my questions.
May we take some questions from the audience?
Of course.
Thank you. Can you give me a mic? So we would like to have questions from you, and I'm sitting here filling up my notebook with lots of questions that I would ask, and I'm grateful to you for addressing the issue of Palestine. hard to imagine a state that's made of Swiss cheese, and how we protect that state from the international community is an ongoing heartache. Do you have questions? Yes, Ibrahim.
Can we use the microphone? Use the mic, please. Use the microphone just back.
I'm a structural engineer, and I learned that you can never build a stable structure on wrong foundations. When I look at the map of the world today in Africa and Asia, the borders were drawn by colonial powers that divided tribes and created all the reasons for the genocides and all the troubles that we see in Rwanda and in other places as well. That's one side, that the map of the world actually is fundamentally wrong or based on wrong foundations. The other wrong thing is that we created this dysfunctional place or organization called the United Nations, which in my opinion actually is something to laugh at, is not really something to respect. I came from third world country, and we laugh quite frankly about the United Nations because it's kind of a club for the big boys to legitimize their actually greed and their colonial interests, which are still going around. My question to you is, since you also mentioned that if 2/3 of the membership of the General Assembly can overrule the Security Council, why wouldn't somebody like you lead a worldwide movement to actually reshape the United Nations on more respectable foundations?
Thank you for your question. I would, in my seminars at the university, I'm teaching in Germany now, I always say the United Nations has many faces. The United Nations has a political face, that's the face we talked about here. The Security Council, the General Assembly. But one must not forget the 55,000 international civil servants that are every single day, maybe in a bureaucratic way, maybe not as competent as some expect, but 55,000 people in the whole system. The World Health Organization, UNESCO, UNICEF, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the many others are trying as best as they can with very limited resources to do that which is in this UN Charter. I want to protect them. I want to say they do what one should do. The political side is the problem. And there is no shortage. I hand out to my students a three-page sheet which shows 15 UN reports that have been compiled over the last 15 years that make very good and very strong recommendations. But the political will to take these and implement them doesn't exist. Why? Because member governments, well, I don't want to leave a church here and be considered as anti-American, but if Jesse Helms, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the US Senate, comes into the UN Security Council when I am in Baghdad, after Lloyd Exworthy, Canadian foreign minister, had just said the United Nations is there for the benefit of all its member countries. And Jesse Helms comes and says, pointing at these 15 ambassadors that sit there, if you do what we want you to do in the US Congress, we will support you. And if you don't do that, we will marginalize you. With that attitude, you won't get reforms on the ground. For example, first of all, let me remind ourselves who is in the UN Security Council, the P5 group, the 5 permanent members. Is it a coincidence that all 5 are representing the winners of the Second World War. China, Russia, France, UK, and the US. They are adamant to initiatives. They don't want major reforms that are demanded by countries like Brazil, Japan, India, South Africa, and others who say, hey, listen, we represent a much bigger chunk of global population than France, England, and so on. So there's a stalemate. How do we get out of this? I wish I had a good answer for you. But there is no shortage of solid proposals to make the United Nations a stronger institution. The veto, for example, this veto, for many years it was the Russians who would veto anything that had to do with criticism of the USSR, the collection of Russian states. Recently it's more the US. Any critical observation on Israel is vetoed by the Security Council. And the veto has become counterproductive. So there are very concrete proposals on how to make that council more productive. One example that I think is very worthy of consideration, if you're innocent, and that is a two-thirds majority should replace the veto. When two-thirds in the UN Security Council are supporting something, then it should have weight. But this inordinate and frequent use of the veto by one country that destroys then what the other 14 may have been proposed is very problematic, to put it very mildly, for the international community. Now, your other point was, why don't people like I, first of all, a diplomat in the UN doesn't have political weight. Our weight is the weight of conscience. Our weight is the weight of conscience. Our weight, we do not have a political weight except to make sure that what we do is strictly in accordance with the spirit and the letter of the UN Charter. Okay, that's one thing. Secondly, the UN couldn't be at a weaker level than it is right now, financially and otherwise. If you push into the United Nations people who have a dubious background, or worse, who come from intelligence, it's already a terrible violation of this. This book defines very clearly who should work for the United Nations. If you give to the United Nations a budget, if you approve a budget which is less, I know what I'm talking about, less than Columbia University has as an annual budget. And if you if you compare the New York Fire Department and the New York and Police Department, these two I made a comparison, that they have a budget that is double the budget the United Nations has. So we are kept at a very low, we say in German, very low flame. We are not allowed, the leash is very short. And then you expect that a few of us who believe in the UN, whether we are serving in the UN or not, can make a big difference. Then I can only say to myself, the difference we can make is by sitting in a church like this one here and debating with you, trying to convince you that it is it's worth your time to reflect on these kind of issues. The answers theoretically are available. The implementation is lacking completely, and there is very little courage by nations to come and stand up and say, sorry Russia, we don't accept this. Sorry Russia, US, we don't accept this. That isn't happening, and that's a tragedy, particularly in this country when you remember who were the people. I just this morning looked at the US Constitution. I was interested, and then it struck me, the US Constitution has the same wording with one little difference. In the case of the UN, there's an S. In the case of the US, the S is lacking. What am I talking about? The US Constitution starts by saying, we the people of the United States. And how does this start? We the peoples, because there are more than one people. We the peoples, not we the governments. And yet, this booklet makes that point, but the people and their decisions and their preferences are ignored. Example, you remember when the protest movements in the UK against the US, against the UN sanctions? The majority in the UK were against the sanctions. The majority in Spain were against the sanctions. The majority in Italy were against the sanctions. And their parliaments did the opposite. Is that democracy? I don't think so. And then you want humble individuals like myself traveling. Yes, we travel a lot. Yes, we try a lot. We write, we think, we sometimes even protest. I'm very uneasy when I stand in front of Downing Street 10 with this book in the hand and I protest against the Downing Street 10 Iraq policy. But there are attempts. But who are we? We are a small group of people, and we try, but there is a much bigger canvas of political decision-making which leaves people like you and I out. Does that mean we shouldn't continue to try? No, it doesn't mean that. We should continue to try. And the more we, I was in Harvard, a young person, in Yale, I was in Harvard too, but in Yale, a young person asked me last week, what can we do? What can we as young people do? And my answer was, the best thing you can do is equip yourself with knowledge, because when you have knowledge, then you can fight back. But if you don't have the knowledge, what can you do? You are overruled by those who think they have knowledge.
Before you ask your question, before you ask your question, Dick is going to come among you and ask you to contribute tonight to support the work that Hans is doing. Truly, in my experience with the sanctions and in the time period since then, I've said this so many times, Hans, if you look up in the English dictionary and it says gentleman, you're the definition.
Thank you.
Well, because you have courage, because you have truth, because you speak these words so clearly that I think they compel us to be more courageous ourselves. When we were in Iraq with you, you compelled us to continue. And when we came back, we said, to everyone that we could think of, Hans von Sponeck says, because you're the authority with integrity. So I'm deeply grateful to you. And as Dick, will you want to address that?
Yes, and we also have some evening expenses to meet as well.
Okay, so please be generous with your contributions tonight. Okay,
but can I just go back to you? You nodded your head in despair a few times.
Right.
Okay, please.
Okay, go ahead. Next question.
Yeah, you mentioned that word sanctions a number of times. Could you explain exactly what sanctions are and how it operate in this case against these Iraq and Iran?
Well, first of all, there are unilateral sanctions when a government imposes measures to reduce the relationship between themselves and the country that they think is straying off the path. And then you have multilateral sanctions. And in the case of Iraq and Iran, the sanctions are imposed by the UN Security Council. In the case of Iraq, they were the most comprehensive sanctions that had ever been imposed on a country. Every single individual in that country was affected by that. Example, I knew a person who needed surgery out of Iraq in the neighboring country, Amman. He had a bank account in England, and he was not able to get his resources to pay for the operation because there were sanctions. So, very comprehensive. This is why Mr. Kofi Annan talked about the blunt instrument of comprehensive sanctions must be eliminated. In the case of Iran, the term I referred to was smart sanctions, but the impact is quite similar to that impact that prevailed in Iraq. So these are measures to say to a country, we do not agree with the way you participate in the community of nations, and therefore we will punish you. That, I think, is maybe a simple way of putting it. Okay?
If you're writing a check, who did they write the check? Dick? Dick? Who did they write a check to? Okay.
Well, the problem with the responsibility to protect and humanitarian war is specifically in the United States. It's a different problem we have here in the United States than all the other member countries. The historical actors who cause wars to happen and the decision process to war in the United States are a matter of historical record. It is like the oil industry, financial interests supporting the dollar hegemony, and the general industrial base of the United States, which depends on having a powerful dollar and forcing other countries to sell their stuff for dollars. You also have religious interests, and you have Zionist interests and other interests that actually are part of the coalition that causes the United States to go to war. None of the wars since at least World War II have been self-defense, and I can't recall if any of them were actually humanitarian or motivated by the responsibility or motive to protect anybody. So we have a different problem here in the United States than you might have on a philosophical level or a global United Nations approach to this. And so what I'd like to suggest is that the responsibility to protect is like the 5% in the United States who might have humanitarian interests. And these people are not sufficient. They don't have enough heft politically to actually move the United States to protect any countries. But instead, they become useful idiots to support the latest war. And so they really don't need the responsibility to protect stuff here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that opinion of yours. Well, it is an opinion, and I still think that the U.S. Has to accept the concept as it was identified in the UN summit of 2005. You know, it is a very valuable concept, and if you look at it, it really isn't new. It's only in a formal sense new. But if you read the Charter, every page is about our collective responsibility to protect. And we stray off the highway when we apply it the way we have done it in the case of Libya. And, you know, this hidden agenda I talk about, it's so visible when you look at other theaters where this where good intentions were pronounced, but something quite different lurked in the background. And I'm very well familiar with the Iraq situation, and I can tell you it was nauseating the way we played our game in Iraq. And it had not the simplistic answer is often given, it's about oil. No, it was about much more than oil. It was about the control of oil. Is one thing. It was about our belief that Western values are better than other countries, other cultures' values, and similar things. So I think I hope so much that we finally, not voluntarily, not easily, reflect a little bit more whether it isn't better that we accept the heterogeneity of this situation, that we are willing, in a very simplistic way I put it to you, that we are willing to recognize you can eat rice with a fork, you can eat rice with chopsticks and you can eat rice with your fingers. Who tells you or me that one method is better than the other? I think that is so clear. When the UN started, there were 51 member countries. They were mostly Western. In fact, the UN was so Western that something happened which in international law is probably unique. Russia, the USSR at the time, had 3 votes in the General Assembly. You probably didn't know that. 3 votes in order to create a little bit of a balance. Ukraine and Belarus had votes together with Russia proper within the USSR. That was one member country in the UN. So we were very Western. And we, because of our successes, in a superficial way, our successes over the years, we have come to believe that what we do must be the best. Maybe it's good, maybe others can learn, but we can also learn from others. And that mentality, that has to be created, and then concepts like R2P receive powerful meaning. But if we're using this as a pretext to continue to be out for our limited interests, then I'm afraid things will go wrong. Continue to go wrong.
Thank you. I have long admired your clarity and courage in a world where there's much too little of both. My struggle with R2P is twofold, and I'd like you to comment on that. First, it is, while it's clearly there's much to support and more restrictive, in 15 centuries of the just war tradition, just war theory has primarily functioned, almost exclusively functioned as justified war. And R2P has the danger of being just another restrictive just war theory. And I'm not sure that just war can be recovered. I don't believe it can in any useful way. Secondly, it is primarily dependent on military answers. So my question to you is, how do you see R2P relating to just war? And secondly, what is the role of nonviolent intervention in R2P or on any global scale?
Thank you. First of all, I think, at least in Central Europe, the debate about just war is over. It's today about just peace, no longer about just war. And people remember the Sermon of the Mount and what it says in there about conflicts and about this whole idea of just war is rejected even then. But over the years, the churches have restarted. And I remember when I resigned from Iraq and I was invited by the Protestant church in Germany to speak, and they were defending the concept of just war. I was so horrified. No, the ultima ratio is just war. But today you don't see that anymore. I have a very interesting, unfortunately it's in German, otherwise I would give it to you, paper on this subject where the conclusion is this is no longer acceptable. And R2P, yes, I do agree fully with you. The danger is there, as we have seen in Libya, that what is perceived to be a just war then is given the title R2P. But that, I think, is not acceptable, and we see in the case of Syria, it doesn't float, it doesn't go. Then this whole booklet is about nonviolent solution of conflicts. And there is a Chapter VI that makes that point. And there's a Chapter VII that says, under exceptional circumstances, not just war, but just the right of self-defense. The right of in other words, you can react militarily if it is very clear that you're about to be attacked. You can do that. But it is for the Security Council that must legitimize that. If the Security Council doesn't do that, then what you think is your right of response because you perceive that somebody is about to attack you is illegal. So the preference, of course, this is a peace organization. The preference is to apply nonviolent means of conflict resolution, And the problem is that this booklet is used like you use a tool in a box. When it suits you, again, not you, US, but you, international community, you use it. And if it is not useful, you ignore it. March 19, 2003, the British and the American governments said, this tool we need isn't here, therefore we leave. And it became an illegal invasion into Iraq. In 1990, the British and the Americans said we need that tool to protect a country that was invaded. It was legal. So sometimes it's used correctly, sometimes it's not used correctly. Yugoslavia was another case where this was not condoned by the UN at all, what happened, the NATO attack on Yugoslavia. So you can't selectively use this. And let me also say this, sometimes I hear, oh my God, you blue-eyed boy, what you are proposing here is so fantastic. I propose nothing, it's in here. And if you are a member of the United Nations, then this is for you international law. And when Colonel Gaddafi a few years ago went to the UN's General Assembly to make the speeches, these wonderful rhetorical statements, the best the world has seen or heard, but the moment they walk out of the General Assembly, they do something quite differently. But Gaddafi took this booklet and he wanted to rip it. Thank God it was too thick. He couldn't rip it. But the point is, every member country is at liberty to say goodbye to the United Nations. But as long as they are members, this is not blue-eyed stuff, this is a legal obligation to abide by this thing. Yes, that's not blue-eyed. If you violate, the onus is on you to try to rectify it, not on me who reminds you of this. So it's that double standard. We are having this frightful legacy of double standards in international relations, year after year. And if a country is so powerful as the United States of America is militarily, then it gets away with that. Should it get away with it? No, it should not. Will it in the future get away? I don't think so. Because we are undergoing, maybe not so noticeable, fundamental, but really fundamental changes in international relations right now. The eastern extension of NATO is grooming Russia as our new enemy. These anti-missile defense systems that we are building in Turkey, Spain, Romania, and Poland now, after Czech dropped out, and Germany being a hub, which hurts me a lot. I think the German public hasn't realized that yet because it's very new, is grooming Russia as a new enemy. And forgive me, the current US administration proud announcement of a new Pacific policy is grooming China as the new enemy. You can compete with China, but you can compete peacefully with China. But you don't start in South Korea, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in Australia, to start expanding your bases, your military presence, and hope that you will contain China. No, you will not contain China. Who are we? This morning, I looked up the numbers. You have a population of about 300 million American citizens. In Canada, there are another 38 million people. That makes it 300, let's say 350. In Europe, Europe has about 500 million people. That makes 850 million people out of 7.3 billion people. We are just a minority. And we are increasingly, we in Europe and you here, are increasingly incapable of calling the shots. So what are we doing? Why are we then going that road of more confrontation? And I see it so clearly in front of me now, because what is linked, for example, to the specific policy change of the US is intimately linked to developments in Central Asia. After 2014, when the US and international coalition forces come home, what do we leave behind? A totally confused, fragmented Central Asia, not just Afghanistan, and then sides will be taken. Some will go with the US, some will go with China, and we have a beautiful new major conflict. And that cannot possibly augur well for our world of tomorrow, unless we find a roundabout where we can change direction.
Thank you. Yes? Even though my eyes aren't blue, it's okay. As you've held up several times the Charter of the United Nations, it occurred to me that essentially there's no oversight on whatever actions the Security Council takes. Is one of the proposed reforms, leaving aside all the political difficulties of implementing it, having an independent court, the same way as in principle we contend we have in this country an independent court system which compares the actions of Congress with the Constitution of the United States. Has that been a proposal put forth for the United Nations?
Not to my knowledge.
No.
Not to my knowledge, no. We have a court system. We have the International Criminal Court, which is a non-UN institution, and we have the International Court of Justice, which is a UN in a body. And I don't know of any suggestion that would introduce what I think is so needed, and that is a system of accountability.
Would that second court, which is a United Nations court, have in its purview the ability to judge actions as they are actually carried out, for example in Libya, and stand up and judge independently that this is in violation of the actual terms of the resolution? Is that a possibility legally?
The first part of your question, the answer is yes. They have that possibility. Are they impartial? I don't think so. And the International Court of Justice, which is not even a UN court, has tried 7 Africans.
Yes.
Where are the Europeans?
Yes.
Where are the Americans?
Yes.
Where are the Asians?
Yes.
So it's partial. Now, people will not accept this when I say that, but that's the fact.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I could add to that because Reverend Moe asked the question about genocide. Lawyers on my behalf sued the government on the issue of genocide, saying 500,000 children, excess deaths of children is arguably genocide. And the federal judge, upheld by the appeals court, said, we don't need to hear whether or not the evidence, whether this is genocide. We have to accept it was genocide. But Congress has immunized itself from any threat of a suit in a federal court of genocide. So they dismissed the case. And I think that's an awful and stunning indictment of our court system, where the Supreme Court even would not hear the case, hear our petition, essentially concluding that if Congress wishes to commit genocide, our court system will not look at that in the same way as they will not look at the issue of the supreme international crime of war of aggression, as you pointed out. So I just wish people to know that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Can you go to this?
Does the UN court take cases against the actions carried out by the Security Council? Because my understanding was that there is no judiciary body in the world that you could take a case against the Security Council to.
The International Court of Justice, the UN judicial body, can entertain only requests from state parties. Okay, if two states agree, and most often the warring parties, Iraq, US, for example, don't agree together to go to the International Court of Justice. But interesting, the UN Court of Justice can also issue at the request of any UN body, only UN bodies. If the World Health Organization or UNICEF want to ask the Court of Justice for an advisory opinion, they can do so. And in that case, the International Court of Justice could theoretically answer issues regarding policies by the UN Security Council. But it hasn't happened. Now, you can ask, why has it not happened? I think I can speculate,
Who could have started it? Who could have initiated that? What person or what entity?
The Director General of the World Health Organization could initiate that.
In case you were still at the UN, working for the UN, could you have done that?
As an individual, no.
With the position
as a senior official, having convinced my bosses, yes. The Secretary General could have done that. The Executive Director of UNICEF could have done that. But it didn't happen. The UN is, in many ways, unfortunately, also very shy. Why is the UN shy? Well, for one very practical reason. The UN relies on countries like yours to get money. So there's a bias here. And it is, let me, if you have enough, let me just, I talk to you about the miserable budget of the United Nations. I mean, the UN is with 2.6 billion, that's this year's budget, 2.6 billion is what the Secretariat has in New York to finance New York plus a few centers in different parts of the world. 2.6 billion. If you add everything, every agency of the United Nations and their resources, then you get for last year just about, including peacekeeping operations, $24 billion. Now, $24 billion to you and me sounds like a lot. But if I tell you now as a comparison, these figures are not, I mean, they are in my hard disk so clearly that you can rely on them. We, in 2005, 2006, 2007, the monthly cost of keeping the US military in Iraq, $12 billion. That means $144 billion a year against the UN budget of 24. That is, the whole UN system had a resource that was equal to 2 months of maintaining the troops in Iraq during those years. That shows you, and if you break it down also, maybe one more figure too. The UN would publish reports on Iraq and on the inflow of, in quote, humanitarian goods and the value of these goods. First of all, it wasn't humanitarian, because what the person in the public doesn't know is that every single cent of what went into Iraq as humanitarian goods was paid for by the Iraqis themselves. It came out of oil money. My salary was paid by the Iraqi government. Every UN action was paid for by the Iraqis. So the UN says we had 64 billion for the oil for food program, 6.5 years, 43 billion were available for, in quote, humanitarian efforts. out of the 43, 28 billion actually arrived in Iraq. Don't ask me now why the difference, I can explain, but not now maybe. 28 billion. That's where the UN stopped. The UN should have gone one big step further and tell you, and then you and I can understand it, that this amounted to 51 cents per person per day for the average Iraqis. We assume 23 million Iraqis at that time. 51 cents. A cup of coffee, I tell students, you can't get for 51 cents. They had 51 cents, and 60 to 70% of the people relied on this amount in Iraq. These are the orders of magnitude that make you angry, because it's all so little and so inadequate. And there are proposals. There's the Tobin tax. You have heard of the Tobin tax, assessing financial transactions of Canada to the US or Germany to Belgium, a tiny fraction of a percent to be added, and the resources out of that would go for international activities, including the United Nations. Were this to happen, the UN would be in much better shape. We could do much more, and we could do it maybe better. We could recruit also at different levels. It's not meant to be. The UN isn't supposed to be a strong institution, and we see the end results.